Hello, George Hepworth, Grover Park Consulting. We're building the Lander Trail Foundation, an online searchable database using Power Apps for the interface and SQL Server for the database. In the previous video, I showed you my preferred method of saving either a new record to a table or saving changes to an existing record to the table using the patch command. I prefer that method over the Power Apps forms because I find forms awkward to use. In explaining that to you, we observed a couple of things that I wanted to expand on in this video. Let me take it out of play mode. We'll go to the code behind the save button. We're now looking at the patch command. I won't review this part. We talked about that last time. If you want to know more about that, you can go back and look there. Between the curly brackets, we have a series of name-value pairs which correspond to the fields in the table and the values we're going to add or update in those fields. There are two ways in which I've captured the values, and that's what I want to focus on today. In some cases, I brought in the value from the control on the screen. In some cases, I grabbed a variable. In order to explain why I did this and how it works and the differences, I'm going to take a step aside, talk briefly about the concept of variables in the Power Apps environment and show you why I chose to use variables for each of these fields. To help illustrate one of the important attributes or properties of variables, I set up a little demo. Let me preface that by explaining that there are public and private variables, or global or local variables, or app level and context level variables in Power Apps, just as we have public and private variables in VBA. Public variables retain their value throughout the scope of the application. Private variables only retain their value within the context of the sub or the function where they run. Let's look at this little example and see how that compares to the VBA version. I created a variable and I instantiated it in two different ways, and I'll show you that instantiation next. On this screen, it's instantiated using the update context method. That says, give this variable a value only within the context of the screen where it is running now. That's the equivalent of a private variable. On this screen, the variable was created using the set command. It means create this as a global variable or a app-wide variable or a session variable. It will retain the same value throughout the application regardless of what screen you're looking at, unless you set it to a different value explicitly in your code. Let's go back and look at how we did that. We'll return to the design view, and I have opened the onVisible event of this screen to show you the two alternative ways to define a variable and give it different values. First, using the update context approach. When we use the update context method, the value assigned to the variable is valid only while that screen is visible, only within the context of that screen. The alternative is a global instantiation, and we use set. And when you give a variable the value using set, that value is retained globally. Update context will override the global set approach. And that's what we see working here. In this screen, I used update context, and that 2000 value overrides the underlying value of the variable created with set. Sample variable is the same variable. It has the global value of 1000. within the context of this screen, where I apply the update context method, it overrides the global value and assigns it a value of 2000. As you can see, that can be potentially quite confusing, and in fact, the reason I took this detour from discussing the process by which we save records is that I in fact confused myself a great deal early on. My logic was always correct, but because I was not careful about naming variables to be sure that I was working with either a global or a context variable, I sometimes ran into situations where I thought I was going to get one value, but I got a different one because I had used either the update context or the set approach, and because I had named the variables with the same name in those two contexts, it actually made a difference where and how I used it, what that variable did. Eventually, I realized the problem was not the logic, but the naming convention and the approach I was using. So I'm going to show you what I am in the process of adopting to correct that problem. To finish up our discussion of variables and how we use them in our patch command to save changes to our record, I'm going to focus on these three combo boxes. I'm not going to change publisher because I'll forget what the original publisher was and not be able to recover it. So I'm just going to change these three. Drop-down boxes, just like they do in the Access world, offer options from which you can choose. Let's call this, instead of a book, let's call it a periodical. And instead of having it be in good media condition, we'll say we don't know, I haven't actually seen it. And we'll just change the location arbitrarily to some other location in the library. Okay, before we actually save this record with the changes, let's look at the variables that we're setting here and talk about how they're used. The media type, which we've set to periodical. Combo boxes have an on-change event. The on-change event is parallel to the after update event that we would see in VBA. When that runs, executes this update context command to create a variable from the media type ID. It gets its value from the combo box. It gets its value from the selected record in the combo box, which in this case again is periodical. And it gets its final value from the primary key or media type ID of that record in that control. That means that variable will contain the primary key value of the periodical or the book or whatever other media type you have, and it will save that as the foreign key in this table. And these other controls work the same way. Let's run it again. We're all set. When I click the Save button, that will run the patch command, which will update the underlying record in my SQL Server table using the values that were set on the on-change event of each of these three combo boxes. After it's run, it returns to this screen, which is the main screen. It has not yet updated. If I click it to select it, that forces it to update itself in this display. This is a refresh issue. If we go back again, we should see our changes. Refresh here. Set it back to book. Back to good. And again, an arbitrary bottom shelf. Just review what's going to happen. Patch command will grab each of those values with the context variables and push them into the underlying table, changing the foreign key values in each of those fields. In the next video, I'll come back and look at the global variable here and how that interacts with our entire process. Now that you understand the difference between global and local or session level versus screen level variables, that'll make more sense. Run the app, hit my save button to save my changes, click the screen to make it update itself, and now we're back good as gold. In this video, I've explained the difference between context variables and global variables, or session level variables, or app level variables. We started by focusing on the context level variables that we need to maintain the details of our publication through the combo boxes. We use the onChange event of the combo box, set the context variable to the value we want to save back into our database. In the next video, we'll look at the difference between adding a new book and editing an existing book, and how that global variable, gvar publication, comes into play. Once again, I hope you have learned something. I hope you found something worthwhile. If you like what you've seen, please hit the like button. If you want to learn more, please come back and visit me again. Subscribe to my channel. Hit the notification bell so you get notification when I drop the next video. I'll see you next time.